Hi guys, thank you all for tuning in and welcome back to Sewing Clara. Today we'll be making these easy facial masks with lining without any embellishment. I will show you two ways of how to position and stitch on the elastic bands on the sides and two ways of how to stitch on the lining. The list of sewing supplies and materials that you will need for this project is in the description of this video, and the sewing pattern is available in the download section on this homepage. So once you will have all your supplies ready, we can jump right into this. Let's have a look at the pattern first. So I have here a piece of pattern that is 1/2 of our masks. The highlighted section is the so-called seam allowance. You see, the black line marks where the stitch is going to be, but obviously when you're going to stitch two pieces of fabric together, you can't stitch exactly on the edge, so you will need some extra fabric around the edges, and that's seam allowance. I have here this mark that marks the center of this curve, and then I have here two marks which are marks for the elastic bands that you would put behind your ears. And I also wrote down the length of the elastic band that works the best for me, which is 20.5 centimeter. That's something about 8.1 inches. With this pattern, you will have 4 pieces of fabric in total for each mask. You will have 2 pieces for the top layer, for the right side of the mask, for the side that's going to be facing up. So I went with this dark green checked fabric. And then you will have 2 pieces of the fabric that you will use for lining. I decided to use a simple white cotton fabric because I find it very comfortable and it's also very breathable. If you decide to work with a fabric that has some kind of a pattern, it might make sense that you would align both layers of the fabric so that both the left and the right side of your mask would have the same pattern. So for example, here these lines, they're kind of repetitive on the fabric, so it made sense that they would look exactly the same. So when I stitch the mask together, it would be symmetrical. If you would be working with something like this, where the pattern looks more random, it would not matter that much. So it always depends on the type of the pattern. So in this case, it was important, so I folded the fabric long enough until I was happy with how the lines were positioned. And then I put my pattern, my sewing pattern, on the fabric and I pinned it in place like so. I like pinning it around the edges first, so that the sewing pattern would stay in place, and then I like cutting the fabric. You can see that I was a little bit more generous with the seam allowance. You don't have to, that was just me. I think I'm gonna make this mask a little bit bigger than usual. And once I cut these 2 pieces of the checked fabric, I positioned these 2 pieces instead of the sewing pattern on the fabric that I used for my lining, because that way I made sure that the shape and size would be 100% the same. So then I cut out my lining and that was it. So now I'm going to place all 4 layers on the top of each other, and I'm going to mark the center of the mask here, and I will make a little cut because sewing crayons can get wiped away, and if I make the cut only very small, that's a very clear mark where the center is. And then I will mark the places for the elastic bands. So this is where my seam will end, and this is where I want to have the elastic bands. So I will make 4 small cuts on each side, very tiny, because that way I will place the elastic bands in the exactly same spot, and the mask will end up being symmetrical. Next thing I like doing is marking where the seam is supposed to be. So I'm gonna turn it now to this side. I have here a sewing crayon, and I will simply make a line around the edges, but like a little bit further from the edges, which will be my guide for stitching. I do recommend doing this no matter if you're a beginner or advanced, because it's just so much easier and you know where the stitch is supposed to be positioned, and you will end up with a much nicer result. Now I turned the piece to the side where we have the lining. I can actually remove the lining from the checked pattern, and I will mark the seam allowance the same way. I'm using a pen this time so that you can see easier where I'm drawing. So I'm making sure that the seam will be aligned with the outer edge of where the elastic band is supposed to be. That's very important. So I'm gonna do the same I did on the checked fabric. The next step is to stitch together the curved sides of both the top layer of the mask and the lining. I had to select a suitable yarn for the checked fabric, so I have decided to go with dark green because dark green is the main color on this fabric. However, black would have worked just as fine. And as for needles, I'm gonna use one of my sharps. So if you wanna learn more about needles, there is a video about types of needles in this course. You can go ahead and watch it. For my lining, I will use simply a white yarn, and I will not stitch the entire curve together. I will leave a little opening, because once I will stitch these two sides together, I will have to be able to turn the mask to the right side, and for that I will need a little hole. So I'm gonna make the hole here in the center. I will start with the top layer of the fabric, so I will pin the center together at an angle with a few pins. And I double threaded my needle. I already started doing the back stitch along this curve. When you will be making your back stitch, make sure you stay on the line that you drew for your stitch and see that the stitches are as equally long as possible. Don't make them too big. Take your time. I finished stitching, so now I have here the seam allowance. I want to fold it to one side on the inside and to stitch it in place, because otherwise it would be poking me in my nose and it would be super annoying. So I'm gonna turn our mask to the right side. And if you have a pattern like that, and if you worked exactly, all these lines should align nicely in the center. So I turned the mask to the right side. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna slightly pull on each side so that the seam in the middle, that's where the stitch is, would be a little bit flatter. And I'm folding the seam allowance, the extra fabric, for me to the right side, and I will be stitching it in place. I like stitching at an angle, but if that's a little bit difficult for you, you can simply turn the mask to the right side, pull a little bit on each side so that it would be flatter, and pin the seam allowance first in place like so, because again, it might be a little bit easier at the beginning than placing the needles at an angle. However, when I start stitching, I find that it is easier to stitch when the pins are positioned at an angle. But of course you could start stitching from this side, and as long as the pins are facing you with the heads and not with the point, it is safe to stitch that way too. You will just have to pull them out once you reach the point where the pin is, which is something you don't have to do if you position them at an angle. So now that I pinned everything in place, I will simply start replacing my pins by pins put in at an angle so that it would be more convenient for stitching. But again, you can leave them in like so. Just make sure that when you stitch, you're stitching into this direction so that the pointy end is facing away from you so that you can't hurt yourself. Now I double threaded my needle. I'm using the green yarn again. However, this time, since it's on the right side, you could also use a red yarn because there's also red in the fabric and it would be a nice contrast. That is up to you, or you could go with a simple black yarn. Again, I'm using the green yarn. And here you can decide whatever type of stitch you will use. So you can do the back stitch, or a chain stitch, or simply a running stitch, which is something I'm gonna do because it's much faster and easier and it will hold the seam in place sufficiently. Make sure that the stitches are again equally long, and also make sure that you're keeping the same distance from the seam along the entire curve. I'm done with the running stitch, so now the seam is nicely in place, folded to the side and stitched in place so it wouldn't bother me. And I will start working on the lining. So as I said, I will not stitch the entire curve. I will stitch this section and this section, and I'm gonna do again the back stitch. I just finished stitching this and this section, so I'm gonna open the lining, and this time I will fold the seam to the opposite side, so in my case to the left, and I will immediately start pinning the seam at an angle. So the space that I left open so that we could use this hole for turning the mask to the right side is still open. It's not pinned together, and I will go ahead, thread my needle again with the white thread, and I will start creating the running stitch from this point towards the outer edge, and then from this point towards the outer edge. And here you have it. So the seam is stitched to one side, the opening is still free, and we can continue with the next steps. So I will see where the little cuts are that mark each side of the elastic band, and I will position the elastic band in place like so, and I will pin it exactly on the line. You will see in a minute why. Then I grab the elastic band and fold it like so, so that it's not twisted. And I will place it on the other side. And again, I will pin it in place exactly on the line that marks our stitches. And I will do the same on the other side. And then I like folding the mask in the middle and holding the edges to each other like so, and making sure that the distance between the elastic bands is the same and that they are positioned in the very same place on both edges. And now, since you pinned them exactly where the seam is going to be around the edge, you can very carefully, because there are pins, put this mask on and see if the length of the elastics is correct. If it's too loose, make it a bit tighter, try it on again until you reach the desired length. If it's too short, you will have to chop off a longer piece of the elastic and then pin it in place again. Just play with it a little bit, because once they are stitched in place, it's too late. And once you made sure that they are positioned where you want them to be, I recommend grabbing your yarn and stitching them in place exactly on the line that marks your seam. Alright, our elastics are stitched in place. I stitched them on with a couple of back stitches. The top layer of our mask is now facing right side up. So that's the side that is going to be face up when we will be finished. And I'm grabbing the lining and I turned it inside out. So I'm looking at the wrong side and I will place it on the top of our top layer so that the right side of the lining is facing the right side of the top layer of the green fabric and that the wrong sides are facing up on both sides. And the next thing I want to make sure of is that this seam is folding to the opposite side than on the green fabric, because otherwise I would have at some point 4 layers of fabric and that would be very uncomfortable. So I'm gonna align the middle seam and I'm going to place in a pin at an angle here. Again, the seam allowance of the green fabric is folded this way and the seam allowance on the lining is folded this way, so that's good. And now I'm gonna turn the mask like so. And I'm again going to align the seam so that it's centered on both the lining and the green fabric, the main fabric for the mask. And I'm gonna put in a pin like so. So that's the first step. Now I will make sure that these elastic bands are going to stay nicely tucked away inside so that I can't accidentally stitch through them. And I will pin the edges. And I will make sure that I place the pin where the elastic ends so that when I make my stitches and when I turn the mask to the right side, that the elastic will be positioned exactly in the edge. So I have to readjust my line for the stitches here on the lining. And I will do the same on the other side. Again, make sure that the elastic band is tucked away nicely in the middle. Position the lining on the top. Feel with your finger where the elastic band ends and put a pin right there. Do the same on the other side. And then you can put a pin in like so. And you can start marking your edge. If it's difficult for you to keep the distance, you can always use a guide or measuring tape. And once you made your marks, grab a few more pins and pin the edges together. Make sure that you don't accidentally pin the elastic band to the edges, so I always like to fold it or tuck it away before I place my pins. Now all edges are pinned together. I made the line on the side of the lining, the line for our stitches, so I will also stitch from this side. You could have done it on the opposite side, but I personally find that there's a big chance of wiping the sewing crayon away, and I don't care for redoing the line again. And here I simply used a pen because it's from the inside on the lining, no one cares, and that can't be wiped away, so that's why I'm doing it this way. So I will grab my needle. I will thread the needle with the dark green stitch, and I will do the back stitch all around the entire edge. You could of course stitch the pieces together with white stitch, but I like sticking to the color that matches the main fabric, the fabric that's gonna be facing up. That's just my personal preference. Both sides of the mask are now stitched together. I also grabbed the sides and I aligned the stitches on the outer edges just to make sure that they are equally long. That's something I always like doing before I turn my mask to the right side. And now I will grab my scissors and I will cut here at an angle very close to the edge. So I'm gonna mark it here with my pen so that you see clearly the line. So it's at an angle almost touching the edge of the stitch, but far enough so that I cannot cut through the stitch. And that is because when I turn the mask to the right side, I will avoid the fabric bulging out, and this way the edges will be a little bit sharper, a little bit cleaner than if there were that much fabric inside. So I will do it here as well. And now the next step is to use this little opening and to turn our mask to the right side. So I always like grabbing with my finger inside and kind of pushing one of the edges out with my thumb, or you can use any tool that you have, maybe a painting brush or something like that, anything that doesn't have any sharp edges so that you can't accidentally damage your piece. And then once this has been pulled through, I'll do the same with the other side. So I grab inside, push, and then I carefully turn the mask to the right side through the hole in our lining. Once I turned my mask to the right side, I like checking again if the edges are really equally long and if the elastics are really positioned well, because the hole in the lining is not stitched together yet. So now would be the time to fix any imperfections, but it looks good. So the next thing I will do is I will grab the mask like so, and I will start rolling the edge back and forth until I flatten the seam, and I will start pinning the edge in place. And one thing I like doing is when I roll the fabric back and forth, I always roll the lining slightly more inwards than the green fabric, or like the top fabric, so that from the outside I would not see the edge of the lining. That's just it's very subtle, the difference. But when you roll it like so back and forth and you go a little bit inwards with the lining, all you see is the top layer of your mask. Now, if I would simply just push it together, see, you can see the white edge. I don't want that. I want to roll it a little bit inwards. So I put a pin in. It's the little things that make the pieces look really good, and that's one of them. So I will continue pinning around the edge. But before I stitch through the edge, I want to close this opening. So the seam allowance on the lining was folded this way. So when I look at the opening, I will grab the middle and fold the left side towards the right side so that it would be facing the same way like the rest of the seam allowance. And I will play with it a little bit. I find that it's always good to push the mask like so through, so you basically turn it inside out, because then it keeps the shape nicely and you can much easier position the center of this hole. So I will pin it in place like so. And first I will do the ladder stitch in order to close this opening, and then I will simply do the running stitch through the middle. I just finished the ladder stitch, so I'm gonna pinch through so that I come here where normally the next running stitch would be if I continued when I was stitching the seam allowance in place. And I will make sure that I don't pinch through the green fabric on the other side. However, I tried to catch the green fabric so that I would basically stitch the lining to it so that it would not be loose. So it would be kind of caught to the center somehow. So when I would breathe, I could not breathe in the lining, which is something that happens a lot with these masks when the lining is not stitched in place. And trust me, it's super annoying, because happened to me too when I made my first mask, and that made me realize you really want to stitch that lining in place. one way of how you can stitch the lining nicely in place is to stitch exactly through the seam and make sure that you come also through the seam on the other side, through the center, and then make just a really small stitch and come back. And that way you catch the lining to the center without the stitch being really visible. I did it already on a few places, so I can do the sew up here. Now that we are finished with the lining, we can fold the mask to the right side. And the last step is to stitch around this edge. Again, you can choose whatever color you want to use. You could stitch around with red thread, with black thread, with dark green, or with white, whatever looks good to you. I have decided to stick with the dark green thread. And the next choice you have to make is what kind of stitch do you want to make around the edges. I personally find that it's always good to consider that, especially if the lining is another color, you should use a stitch that looks good from both sides, because the back stitch, the classical back stitch, I don't find it so pretty from the other side. So I personally like using either running stitch, fall back stitch, or chain stitch. These are my personal preferences. Tutorials for these stitches are also in this course if you missed that video. And I don't feel like doing anything special in this case because the fabric's very dark and the thread's not gonna be really visible, so I'm not gonna waste my time creating chain stitch. So I'm gonna do simply the running stitch because it's faster, and for me personally it's good enough. So I will start here. I will do a sew up instead of tying the end of my thread, because I'm starting on the right side, so I stitch through a couple of times and then I make a little knot directly on the fabric. If that's something you're not sure about, there is a video called First Steps that explains how to thread a needle and how to do the sew up, so that would be something you might want to watch first. And now that I secured the first stitch sufficiently, I can go on and do the running stitch, but first I have to chop off this tail, and then I will go ahead and create the running stitch around the entire edge of our mask. I will, as always, try to make the stitches as equally long as possible, and I will make sure that I keep the same distance from the edge. Alright, so I just finished with the running stitch around the entire edge, and here is what our mask looks like from the right side, and here is what it looks like from the inside. So you can see the running stitch created with the green thread, but other than that, it's super neat. As you have seen, all you have to be able to do are a few basic stitches. And as long as you have the pattern, there's really nothing to it. You don't need any special skills. The pattern is available for free in the download section on this platform. Now let me show you how to stitch together the lining with the right side of the mask in a little bit different way, and also how to stitch on the elastic band a little bit differently so that you have more options. So I went ahead and I stitched together the centers and these edges, the long edges, and I left these edges open. And now I'm gonna turn the mask to the right side. I will grab my pins and I will start shaping the edge, and I will start pinning it in place, but I will not pin it all the way to the end. So I'm gonna stop about that far from the edge. And now I will fold this edge in. It should be exactly the amount that the seam allowance is. So I will fold it in like so. And I will put in only one pin for the time being in the center. And I'll do the same on the other side. And then I will fold the mask in the middle. And I will make sure that both sides are equally long and that both edges are equally big. And now that I made sure that the result is okay, I will grab my elastic band and I will put it here inside, very close to the edge, and I will pin it in place like so. Then I will go to the other side. I will position the second elastic band in place. If you're having difficulties positioning the elastic band exactly in the edge, put your index finger inside and flatten everything nicely and straighten everything, because then it will be easier to place your elastic band where it belongs. So I'm gonna pin this one as well. And before I pin the other end, I basically measure it with the help of the other one to make sure that they're gonna be equally long. And then I'll pin it in place as well. And before I'll go on and stitch around the entire edge, I will again measure everything, look from the other side if everything looks good. And then I would finish the mask exactly the same way around the edge like we did with the first one. Again, you can do the running stitch or back stitch or chain stitch, whatever looks good to you. One thing you need to know, if you're making the mask for the first time and you don't know for sure how long the elastic bands are supposed to be and you would have to try it on, I do recommend pinning like this around the edges instead of at an angle first. You can always go ahead and pin at an angle once you measured your band, but this way it would be easier to put the mask on because there would be no sharp edges sticking out and you couldn't accidentally hurt yourself. So that's definitely something you should do if you still need to try the mask on. If you already made a few and you know exactly how long the elastic bands are supposed to be, there's no need for that. You can pin at an angle and problem solved. But again, if you need to put the mask on, you should definitely be more careful and pin everything in place so that nothing could scratch you or poke you when you try your mask on. Now let me also show you a really easy way of how to compare the length of the elastic bands before you stitch them on. So I pinned the one elastic band in place and I pinned on the other side the other elastic band only on one side in place, and I put the other end in, but quite far. You can see that it's clearly shorter. And now I will align these edges of the mask. I will put in a pin or two so that the edges will stay aligned. And now I will simply pull slowly on this elastic band and align it with the other one until I'll see that they are equally long. And once I reach the desired length, I will make sure that it's going to be positioned in the corner. Play a little bit with it and measure again, and once I will be sure that the length is exactly the same, I will pin in also the other side. One last check, looks good. I can take out these two pins and pin this side of the mask together, and now I can try it on. So to finish this mask, I want to do the running stitch around the edges again. It's just my favorite way of finishing it because it's pretty fast and I like the way it looks. So I have here this orange denim thread I double threaded my needle, and when I'm gonna make the first stitch, I'm gonna stitch first through here between the lining and the denim section, because I want to hide the knot at the end of my thread. You have to be very careful now here because there are all these pins, and especially the denim thread really likes to tangle, so just take your time. Don't thread it too long, because otherwise it will tangle even more than it already does, and it can be really frustrating. And I will take my time, make really nice equally long stitches, equally far from the edge everywhere. I will make sure to pinch also through the elastic band. I will stitch the elastic band in place additionally once I'll be done with the running stitch, but first things first. So I'm gonna continue doing the running stitch around the entire edge, and then we'll take it from there. I'm at the end, so I will do the sew up between the lining and between the denim section, and you can see that this is still kind of open, and that's where the leather stitch comes. So I will do the leather stitch so that I close this nicely so that the edge is perfectly held together, and that way I can also stitch on additionally the elastic band so that it's really safely in place. I'm using a light beige polyester thread, which is a similar color to the lining, and I will simply pinch the needle somewhere here through, and I will come on the lining side close to the edge through the fabric, and then I will start doing the leather stitch. But when I'm gonna be returning from the denim side to the side of the with the lining, I will pinch through the elastic as well, and that way it will be held securely in place. To be honest, you don't have to do the leather stitch here necessarily. I would recommend stitching the elastic bands in place a little bit more than just with the running stitch, but this edge, if that doesn't bother you, that this is not stitched through all the way to the end, that it's just being held with the running stitch, you don't have to do anything. But I still find that this finishes the piece nicely, but it's up to you. Whatever is important to you. If you don't mind, then you can skip the leather stitch and then you will be basically done. Maybe make a couple of stitches through the elastic band so that it's securely stitched in place, and that would be it. And of course I also have to stitch the lining in the center so that it wouldn't flap around my nose and that I wouldn't breathe it in whenever I take a deep breath. Alright, so I stitched the lining to the center, and both edges are also stitched in place with the leather stitch, and the mask is now finished. Of course, whichever way you want to stitch the lining in, that is entirely up to you. Especially once you found out how long the elastic bands are supposed to be for your personal use, you can try both ways and see which way is more convenient. However, I do believe that, especially if you're making the mask for the first time and you're not sure about the length of the elastic bands, the way we did it with the denim mask would be probably better, because you can still figure out how long they're supposed to be, so that once you've finished, that the mask will be comfortable and that it will fit perfectly. Well, and that is it. I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial, that it has been helpful. Thank you all for watching, and happy sewing!